So ladies and gentlemen, this video has been a very long time coming. Ever since my first full flight videos that I uploaded to the channel, I've been getting questions about my settings, my PC specifications, how I get my sim to look the way it does, but more importantly, how I get my sim to look and perform the way it does as well. Well, this is the answer to all your questions, so let's get started. What's going on, guys? Flyby Simulations here, and welcome to the complete unadulterated guide to making your sim look and perform as well as it can. We'll be looking at various config settings, Microsoft Flight Simulator 2020 in-sim graphics settings, Nvidia control panel settings, as well as everything in between. So this is the holy bible for Sim Update 11 looks and performance, as I like to call it. Now, obviously the intro might be a little overhyped. It's important here to note that everyone's system is different, and several things mentioned in this video will be subjective. The entire point of this video is to walk people through my settings, and that's the key word here. It's my settings, and these settings are a product of hours of testing and tinkering with various elements of the sim to see what works best for me. Since you guys like the appearance of my videos, I feel it's important to share it with you, but then again, I highly encourage you guys to tinker with your own settings based on my settings so you guys can figure out what works best for you. Now, right before we get started, I'd also like to say make sure to give this video a like to reach more like-minded people interested in the world of flight sim and interested in Microsoft Flight Simulator just as you. Also, we're less than 60 subscribers away from 10,000 subscribers, a massive milestone for any YouTube channel out there. So if you're part of the 85% or so of regular viewers that haven't yet subscribed to the channel, then what are you waiting for, guys? Subscribe and turn notifications on to be in the know-how of everything happening in the world of flight sim. That all said, let's get into the video. Alright, so where do we start, ladies and gentlemen? So let's create a frame of reference for you guys. Let's talk about the system specs that I have and what hardware I'm running before jumping into all of the software related settings. So on screen, as you guys can see, I am running the i7-9700K CPU, running at just 3.7 GHz. PC nerds might know that this CPU is capable of way more than 3.7 GHz, but I still have it set to 3.7 GHz. We'll get to why in just a second. I'm also running an RTX 2080 graphics card running at just 1560 MHz. It used to be a flagship GPU when it came out a few years ago, but it's completely outdated now. Like, even if you have an RTX 3060, you'll likely perform better than me. So these settings that I'm going to show you, if they work well for me, they're going to work extra well for you. I'm also running 32 GB of RAM in dual channel, which means that I have two sticks of 16 GB of RAM each at just 2400 MHz of speed, which is rather slow. Again, I'll get to why in just a second. Finally, the sim is installed on a 2 TB SSD with other programs as well. So I don't have a dedicated SSD just for Microsoft Flight Simulator, but I have multiple apps and programs installed concurrently. All of this is on a cutting-edge, state-of-the-art 1080p display, and that's sarcasm, by the way. So it's pretty obvious that my system is relatively mid-level at this point, upper mid-level probably, and if you have a better system than mine, you'll likely see great performance improvements wherever you might be over-demanding from your system in the sim, so wherever you might be expecting great aesthetic improvements but are getting hit with performance losses. Another reason why you might see good improvements is because I am on a gaming laptop. Yes, it's not even a fully functional desktop, but it's a gaming laptop. That is the main reason why all of my components are undervolted or underclocked, because my system simply can't handle the thermal limitations and throttles all the time. Alright, so with the hardware out of the way, let's jump into all of my software related settings. So the order in which these settings will be showcased in this video can be seen on screen. We'll first start with my Windows settings, moving swiftly on to my Nvidia control panel settings, and then we'll look at the user config file for Microsoft Flight Simulator. This is very important if you want to get a little extra performance and fix the grainy cloud textures. And then we'll head into the sim, showcasing all of my graphics settings within the sim, and finally end it off there. Of course, there are chapters in the video for you to skip around and find what you're looking for, but I highly recommend for the best results you watch the full video. So, with that all said, let's get into it. Starting off with, let's go into our Windows bar and type graphics settings. From here, we'll go into change default graphics settings and ensure hardware accelerated GPU scheduling is indeed turned off. This essentially reduces the latency or lag and helps improve the responsiveness of the system. Now, if you have a dedicated GPU, it doesn't matter if you have an Nvidia or AMD dedicated GPU, then you have low latency settings we can always enable through their driver settings. So doing it PC wide using this particular hardware accelerated accelerated GPU scheduling setting doesn't really make sense, and that's why I have it turned off. Going back to the graphics settings, you can also set high performance priority for Microsoft Flight Simulator as a custom option. So as you can see, I have flightsimulator.exe set to high performance. Does this have any effect? Not that I've noticed really, but it doesn't hinder performance either, so I leave it on in hopes that it could be helping improve performance in the background without me realizing it. So if you can't find the program in your list, you can use this browse button to help your PC point to your executable file. Next up, in the Windows bar, type game mode and press enter. So as you can see, I have it on, and I'd highly recommend you turn it on as well. Now, if you asked me this for Sim Update 9 or Sim Update 8, I would have said leave it off, but for this current version of Microsoft Flight Simulator, I have personally noticed that the overall smoothness seems to be much better, and stuttering seems to have reduced overall while keeping game mode on. Game mode essentially prevents Windows, the operating system, from installing updates in the background and essentially provides full resource priority to the game being played, in this case Microsoft Flight Simulator, so it obviously helps. Now that's all for the actual PC Windows settings. Next up, let's head into my Nvidia control panel settings, which is going to be massive. Some big things here for those wanting to get the most out of their Microsoft Flight Simulator experience. Now, if you have an AMD GPU, try replicating these settings to the best of your ability in the AMD equivalent of this program, but this is what the Nvidia control panel looks like. First things first, let's go to the image preview, and I have the base setting set to quality. You can do so by going here and adjusting the slider. As you can see, performance causes these jagged edges to help with performance, but with my tweaks, you should be fine getting a little bit more eye candy here without much FPS sacrificed. Next up, let's go to Manage 3D Settings, and unlike most other settings guides, we don't have much to do here. I prefer leaving the Nvidia control panel practically untouched, except for two very important settings that greatly help improve performance and visual quality. So in the global settings here, I have everything at default apart from image scaling, which allows us to sharpen the sim in real time. We'll get to this when we get into the sim in just a second. Apart from this, everything else is default, so no point walking you through each setting. Moving to program settings, here is where those two important settings I mentioned before are. First of all, select flightsimulator.exe in the Select a Program window. Now here, as you can see, the main setting changed is that the anisotropic filtering is set from the default application control setting to 16x, and ladies and gentlemen, this makes the biggest difference in the world, as it helps improve the level of detail of the terrain that you see in Microsoft Flight Simulator without any cost to performance. Ever since Sim Update 5, for some unholy reason, every consequent update has caused the overall visual clarity of terrain features, especially when seen from high altitudes, to be lowered in the sim. Cranking the terrain level of detail setting in the graphics settings of the sim itself really lowers performance, but setting this setting to 16x completely eliminates the issue for me personally. Even with my terrain of level detail set to just 100 out of 400 in the sim, with this setting set to 16x, I can clearly see terrain far into the horizon, as well as spot various features from altitude. And best of all, performance loss with this set to 16x is absolutely negligible, maybe 1 to 2 FPS if that, so for what you get, it's awesome. Everything else here is pretty much all default until we get to power management, which I have set to prefer maximum performance. This helps with overall smoothness and can even add a few frames in certain situations that demand more from the GPU. The off and clamp settings that you guys are seeing here are automatically changed when you activate the 16x anisotropic filtering that we just did, so nothing for us to do here, that's all automatically done. And that is all for the Nvidia control panel. Now, right before we jump into the sim, the last thing to look at is your user config file to help with those grainy clouds and to get a little extra drip of visual clarity in your sim. So to navigate over to your user config file, it's in the same location as your community folder where you should be able to download all your mods. So if you're struggling to find this file, I'll leave a path to it in the description section of the video. So if you purchased Microsoft Flight Simulator through Steam like me, you'll find it here under AppData, roaming, but it might be slightly different if you purchased it through Microsoft Store or any other means. Regardless, check the description for the official path on how to find your particular UserCfg.opt file. Now here, all this random text might look a little complicated, but all you need to do is scroll down until you get to this post-process portion of the text file. Here you essentially copy all my settings. Ones mean on and zeros mean off, so make sure that post-processing is first turned on and all of these settings are the way they are. Particularly make sure that sharpen is set to on, which is essentially 1, color grading is also set to 1, and most importantly film grain set to off or 0. This is what causes those ugly grainy looking textures on clouds, so simply turn it off here and the problem should be minimized considerably, especially on you folks running a 1080p screen like me. With that all said and done, ladies and gentlemen, let's finally jump into the sim and walk you through my actual graphics settings. So welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to my graphics settings panel in Microsoft Flight Simulator. Without beating around the bush too much, let's just scroll through the settings and show you how I have everything configured and, just generate a little bit of discussion around the various different settings. Starting from the top here, of course, I have the sim running in full screen with the native 1920 by 1080 screen resolution of my monitor. Anti-aliasing, now I have this set to TAA despite new options having been introduced for the sim, aka the Nvidia DLSS options and so on. Now TAA for me gives the best visual experience, the sharpest textures without any graininess or shimmering in the distance, which I personally hate. So I've tried Nvidia DLSS, but it causes severe visual degradation even when set to quality, especially during a moving scene. So I would recommend you to set it to TAA as well, regardless of your machine strength, except if you have an RTX 4090, in which case setting DLSS to on and quality will activate DLSS 3.0, which is a new feature which unlocks massive performance improvements. So it's a rather small use case scenario because most people who are watching, I'm assuming, don't have an RTX 4090. So for most, I'd highly recommend TAA. Next up, moving to render scaling. Now I have this set to 120 because I like my image to be a little sharper while sacrificing a few frames here and there. I don't mind sacrificing those frames for slightly better visual quality on my 1080p display, but if you're running a 4K screen, for example, you can leave it to 100 or even scale it down. The beauty of scaling down on a 4K screen while having TAA on is that your FPS will increase and TAA will automatically temporally super sample the image to make the picture look smoother. So try it out. Obviously, I can't show it on screen because I don't have a 4K screen, but trust me, it works. Moving below, this is the AMD Fidelity FX setting introduced in Sim Update 10. It doesn't have any performance impact on my system, and I've tested it all the way from 0 to 200. It's basically a sharpening filter, and 200 adds a few jagged edges, so 170 has been a sweet spot for me personally. You might like it lower or higher based on your render resolution and screen size and so on, so tinker with it as you please. Moving below, I have VSync turned off as I have a G-Sync capable monitor, and I also have Nvidia Reflex low latency turned off. Again, if you experience lag or responsiveness issues in Sim, turning this setting up might help, but for me, it's a-okay. Coming to the DirectX version, updates continue to be made by Asobo in this department. In Sim Update 11 specifically, they freed up some VRAM overhead for GPUs, claiming to make DX12 more stable, but for me personally, it's still unviable and doesn't work consistently well, so I'm waiting on future updates to make this, plausibly workable for me. So I have my Sim set to run on DX11, which does the trick just fine. Moving below, the global rendering quality is obviously custom as I've changed the individual settings below, so let's take a look at them here. Starting with the terrain level of detail, now I have it set to 100, ladies and gentlemen, and as I said before, upping this to 200 or even 400 is something I can't do personally due to my hardware, and I get very good terrain visibility and clarity by setting the anisotropic filtering setting to 16x in Nvidia control panel, as we saw previously in the video. If you have a better GPU than me and wish to have better looking terrain that spans a little further in the distance, then by all means experiment with this slider and see if you can push your system further. 100 though works for me a-okay, and for systems just like mine, setting the anisotropic filtering to 16x in Nvidia control panel will greatly help you gain some frames here. Same is also true for the objects level of detail, where 100 works just fine. This is very much dependent on your use case scenario. I am predominantly an IFR flyer, which means I usually fly over the clouds and high above the terrain as opposed to VFR flyers. I've noticed upping this setting adds sharper textures to buildings, clutter, and so on, which feels personally unnecessary to me, so I leave it to 100 and my sim still looks spectacular. And this is the case both during the day as well as the night. So I really have no complaints, and that's why I have my objects level of detail and terrain of level of detail both set to 100. Between these two sliders, we have a few more settings. So for the off-screen terrain pre-caching, I'd highly recommend everyone with a modern CPU to leave this to Ultra. It doesn't heavily impact performance whatsoever, but panning the camera in the cockpit is extremely smooth with the setting on Ultra as opposed to low or off. This is because the textures are stored as cache on your system, making the whole panning and moving process more efficient, and I highly recommend putting this to high or Ultra. Moving below, terrain vector data, also set to Ultra personally. I like my water bodies and roads to look nice from a distance, and between individual buildings and overall topography, I choose roads and water bodies all day. So I have this setting to Ultra and buildings to high. Of course, this is all again dependent on how powerful your system is, so if your system is good enough, crank both of these up to Ultra, but this works best for me. Same logic applies here with trees and grass and bushes too, so you can see trees from a distance, so I like them to be more detailed and be more plentiful, hence I have them at Ultra. Grass and bushes I rarely see since I'm flying so high up, so having them set to medium doesn't diminish the overall aesthetic quality of the sim, but adds a few more FPS that I can use elsewhere, so it's all about resource management here, people. Next up, volumetric clouds. Now, I have set these to Ultra because frankly, anything below high just looks like cotton candy. If you have a semi-decent system, I would highly urge sacrificing other settings, even to have clouds be on Ultra, because the cloud definition really shows with the setting on Ultra. If you really can't do Ultra, then switch it to high, but again, as I said, anything below high and you're gonna see visual degradation. Texture resolution is another important one. I can't stress how much this setting makes your sim look sharper and clearer, though it comes at a bit of a performance hit. Similarly, I also have this texture synthesis setting to Ultra. I used to use Nvidia sharpening before that used to hit my frames and make everything sharper in the sim, which wasn't a good thing, but using this has a lower impact on my frames while sharpening certain parts of the scene that look better when sharpened, so I highly recommend this. Moving on to anisotropic filtering, turn this setting completely off since we turned it on in the Nvidia control panel. As mentioned before, this will save you some frames definitely that you can use elsewhere. Moving to texture super sampling, I have it set to 6x6. This affects various ground textures and floor markings, so it's good for the overall airport environment when you're taxiing around and so on. No need to crank it to 8x8 personally. Even if you're on a great system, the visual improvement isn't massive, but I'd say 6x6 hits the sweet spot. Moving on down, the water waves are set to medium. Again, this still renders the waves during windy conditions, but doesn't enhance the details on them. So it's not something I care about as much and saves me a little bit of performance. I will take this all day. Shadow maps, I have it set to 1024, which is the third highest setting, I believe. Microsoft Flight Simulator still has a problem with shadows where they shake and shimmer all over the place, and I've cranked this all the way to the top with no avail. So I stick with 1024 and it does the job for me while giving me semi-decent shadows. Same story goes with terrain shadows. I don't really care if a mountain casts a shadow on the surrounding scenery, so I have it set pretty low. If you guys are trying to film cinematics or have more headroom in your system, by all means, crank it up. Next up, contact shadows and windshield effects are also set to medium. Rain effects are still very nice on medium, and yes, Ultra looks awesome, but the performance hit seems unnecessary for a few extra water droplets or scratches on the windshield, so medium is what I have it set to personally. Ambient occlusion here is set to high. It helps with the shadows overall, so this is the only shadow setting I've set to a decent level to compensate for the other shadow settings that I have set pretty low. Cube map reflections are also set to a pretty low setting of 128 because I don't care for reflections as much, and ray marched reflections are also set to medium. Light shafts are also on medium, but it might help to dial this one up, especially during the day when you're looking for sunlight creeping through the clouds or other scenarios where you might want light to interact with the environment. I'm personally satisfied with it on medium though, but of course, feel free to tinker around with these settings. Moving on below, apart from bloom, I have all of these settings turned off. They basically make your sim look more cinematic, but that detracts from the realistic appearance I want to achieve. Things like motion blur that artificially blurs the image while panning the camera, or lens flare that adds a fake lens flare that you would otherwise get when panning a real-world camera to the sun is something I don't want, as my naked eye in real life wouldn't see or notice these things. The only thing I might periodically turn on here is the depth of field when I want to capture screenshots with some background blur and a bokeh effect, but usually I have it set to off. Finally, at the very bottom here, a pretty important setting that determines performance, the glass cockpit refresh rate is also set to low. This is something I wish I didn't have to do, but unfortunately I have to because setting it to medium or high kills FPS. If you have a better CPU than mine, then by all means feel free to crank it up to a higher setting, but for me, I have to set it to low, which does the trick but isn't something I particularly prefer. And with that, ladies and gentlemen, that brings us to the end of today's settings guide video. I hope I was thorough. I hope that I managed to cover everything that you guys have been asking for so long. If you guys have anything else that you would like to know about the system or how my sim looks, I do have my Nvidia color filter settings as well that I didn't delve into too much in this video. So if you guys want to see that, leave it down in the comment section below. I read all your comments, and as far as I know, I respond to all of your comments as well. So leave it down in the comment section below. I would love to get in touch with you guys. If I got something wrong in this video, do make sure to tell me that as well. And most importantly, guys, join me in my journey to get to 10K subscribers before, I would say, my initial plan was Christmas, but now I would say probably tomorrow. So if we can get to 10K subscribers by tomorrow, I would be a happy man. With that all said, ladies and gentlemen, thanks for flying by.